Good morning, ladies and gentlemen.
Good morning.
How are we doing here today in Hastings On Hudson?
We are good.
So, first and foremost, let me extend congratulations, adulations, and salutations to the organizers of this great event. And for freedom, I mean, how could I not do well today by being introduced by somebody named Freedom? How appropriate is that? So I dedicate today's speech to not only Dr. King, but to a good friend of mine, Michael Lamont Walker, who 8 years ago left us at the age of 46. So I want to say a special hello to my kindred spirit in the academic realm, Joshua Blair, because he's the reason why I'm here today as well, along with Freedom. So I want to thank him publicly and privately. So what I wanted to do today, how many of us have an imagination? Okay, wonderful. One thing about Dr. King is that he was very imaginative. And you can tell by his speeches, the way he spoke, his inspiration, the way he articulated, the way that he moved us was always groundbreaking. You know, Josh and I always talk about folks having intangibles. Well, Dr. King had intangibles. Today, I want to be very imaginative. And many of you know that it's been 50 years since that famous speech that we're going to be seeing today. And I wanted to just imagine for a moment, for just a few moments, that same year, in 1963, that Dr. King convened the meeting of 8 special friends, 4 women and 4 men. And the 4 women that he invited to the special meeting were as follows: Helen Keller, Indira Gandhi, Eleanor Roosevelt, and Maya Angelou. And the 4 men he invited to the meeting were Plato, Herodotus, Malcolm X, and Ralph Waldo Emerson. So as Dr. King invites these wonderful individuals, thought leaders, individuals who set a standard for excellence, he didn't want to call it a retreat that he was hosting. He decided he was going to call it an advance, because retreating is going backwards. So as we're talking with Dr. King at this particular meeting, he turns to Helen Keller and said, "Miss Keller, what would you like to contribute to today's festivities? Is there something you would like to say?" And she says, "Dr. King, I would. There's a few things I would say." And he says the same thing to all of the 8 individuals. And so let's start with Maya Angelou. He says, "Miss Angelou, what would you like to add to the proceedings?" And she says something very profound. She says, "We must recognize and celebrate the contributions of our sheroes and heroes." And Dr. King says, "Thank you, Maya. We appreciate you." He turns to Eleanor Roosevelt and says, "Miss Roosevelt, you've been a thought leader your entire life. What would you like to add to these proceedings?" And Eleanor Roosevelt says, in the way that she can only say it, "No one can make you feel inferior without your consent." Dr. King then turns to Indira Gandhi and says, "Miss Gandhi, please share with us your thoughts." And Indira Gandhi says, "Dr. King, this is what I would like to share." She says, "You cannot shake hands with a clenched fist." And then finally, he turns to Helen Keller and says, "Miss Keller, what is it that you would like to leave this assembled group with?" And she says to Dr. King, "I long to accomplish a great and noble task, but it is my chief duty to accomplish smaller tasks as if they were great and noble." So those are the 4 women. Now, no pressure for the 4 men who haven't spoken yet. So he says to Plato, "So Plato, based on seniority, we're going to allow you to speak first." So Plato says, and I love Plato, I like Greek mythology. My middle name's Theodorus, so you can understand why I like Greek mythology. So Plato says something very interesting. He says, "Dr. King, there's something really important I'd like to share." And he says, "What is that, Plato?" And Plato says, there's a few things I've said over the years. Which one should I share? And what Plato says is this: Wise men and women talk because they have something to say. Fools, because they have to say something. So then he turns to Herodotus. It says, Herodotus, between Plato and Aristotle and Socrates, you're the least of the known Greek authors, if you will. What is it that you would like to share? So Herodotus says, well, what I'd like to share is real simple. Neither snow nor rain nor heat nor gloom of night stays these couriers from the swift completion of their appointed rounds. And Dr. King says, I understand it. So then he turns to Malcolm X and says, Malcolm, thank you so much for being here today. What would you like to share at this wonderful meeting that we're having? And Malcolm says, well, Dr. King, as you know, you and I have had different philosophies and different lenses that we've shared over the years. And I do have something that I'd like to share. And Malcolm X talks about the whole notion of truth and honesty and integrity, and making sure that we understand our institutional capital. And then last but not least, Ralph Waldo Emerson rises to speak because he's an author and well known for his writings. And Ralph Waldo Emerson says in very profound fashion, do not go where the path may lead, instead go where there is no path and leave a trail. So as you listen to these 8 individuals at this imaginary meeting, what comes to mind? Well, what comes to mind for me is that, in my mind, this meeting actually did take place. Because oftentimes, as we have learned from Dr. King, we need to understand that he is and still is a playmaker. And my question is, how many of us in this room are playmakers? And what playmakers do is put people around them in a position to make plays. And that's exactly what Dr. King did at this imaginary meeting. So let's kind of fast forward to current times. So we said this meeting was 50 years ago. So the next segment I'm going to talk about for just a couple of minutes, and by the way, I'm built for comfort, not for speed. And I'm slow and luxurious, not fast and furious. But I will finish in the allotted time that freedom has given me. So the next segment I thought I would share about Dr. King, and then I'll tell you my indirect connection to his legacy, and I'm humbled to be part of that, is what would Martin say, is my next segment. So what would Martin say about the fact that there are 2 countries in the world, each who have 20% of the world's population, China and India, and in the next few years, a continent named Africa will have 20% of the world's population. Now, I don't do math, that's why I went to law school. But I will tell you, that's 60% of the world's population. What would Martin say? What would Martin say if I shared with you that the United States only consumes 5% of the world's population? What would Martin say? What would Martin say if he knew that there were 80 million baby boomers, many of them who are in the room today? Martin would say we need to embrace them, validate them, make sure that we engage in knowledge transfer. What would Martin say if he knew that over the next 20 years, 10,000 of these baby boomers can retire every day? What would Martin say? What would Martin say if he knew that there were 60 million individuals with disabilities? What would Martin say? Martin would say, they're capable individuals, just like able-bodied people. We should embrace them. We should love them. And Martin would say, if you look around the room, individuals with disabilities is a very special connection to all of us, because it's the only protected class that each and every one of us can be a member of. Think about it. Through birth, injury, illness, or ageism, we can all be part of this special class. So what would Martin say that over a 4-year period, between 2003, 2004, 2005, and 2006, you had MySpace, Facebook, YouTube, Twitter. What would Martin say? What would Martin say about leadership? Something that I'm very passionate about, as Joshua Blair knows. Although I teach law courses, that's fine, I enjoy that. But my sweet spot is teaching leadership. So what would Martin say about all these books on leadership? Good to Great by Jim Collins, The Engaging Leader by Ed Gutman, The Authentic Leader by Bill George. Martin would say, well, those are all men. So what I'd like to say is, what would Martin say? Well, Martin would ask, well, where are the leadership books on women? Written by women. And I would tell him that my favorite book on leadership is by a woman by the name of Diana Whitney. And she has 5 principles that Martin would love. The first, inquiry. The second, inspiration. The third, inclusion. The fourth, illumination. And the fifth, integrity. What would Martin say about the Dougie, the Running Man, the Foxtrot, the Two-Step, the Paso Doble, the Chicken Noodle Soup? What would Martin say? What would Martin say about this whole notion that leadership is a spectator sport? Martin would disagree. Leadership is not a spectator sport. You've got to get on the field and have access to the playbook. What would Martin say about all the different drama and conflict that we're dealing with in the world? What would Martin say? What would Martin say about how we manage conflict amongst ourselves? What would Martin say? What would Martin say when we have discussions at work that often lead to what we call blame storming, where we attack each other? What would Martin say? I suggest that instead of calling it blame storming, let's call it brainstorming. What would Martin say if we had differences of opinion, and if we did that, we don't personally attack each other? We can engage in what's called respectful conflict. What would Martin say? So, one of the things that the organizers of this wonderful event wanted me to do is talk a little bit about my connection to Martin Luther King Jr. Well, I'm 55 years young, and so I never had a chance of meeting Martin, but I felt like I did. When I was growing up in the South Bronx, at the age of 10, my mother and 2 grandmothers announced that we were moving to Long Island. So I'm an inquisitive 10-year-old child. So I asked, well, what part of Long Island are we moving to? And they say to me, Far Rockaway. So I said, well, that's not on Long Island. They said, shut up, boy, we're moving to Long Island. So before we left, of course, in most households in the late 60s, there were 3 pictures that were on the walls of houses and projects. And it never really struck me until later on in my life that all 3 of these individuals had all died for what they believed in. One of them was Martin Luther King Jr. So when I got to this place called Far Rockaway, I decided at age 12 in 6th grade that I would run for this office called Sanitation Commissioner. Now, can someone in this room, in Hastings on Hudson, tell me what a sanitation commissioner does in 6th grade? Absolutely nothing. But for me, it was my way of public service, because I knew that was the respect and civility that Dr. King believed in. And for me, it was me and I was just talking to Travis, me and some of my close friends, as he has as a young man who's 19 years old. You would go around the school, you know, because you can count on your boys, right, Travis? Go around the school, just picking up what? Trash. Because you wanted to clean the school. So, fast forward through student government and going to college, Martin Luther King Scholarship, no pressure for me. And the Martin Luther King Scholarship that I earned was an academic scholarship. Now, you have to understand, this is an oxymoron. I played college football. So academic scholarship and college football doesn't really connect. But for whatever reason, it did for me. That's fine. So then I found out that Martin Luther King Jr. was not only a wonderful leader, which of course I knew, he was also a member of this organization that I would later find out was a great organization named Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity. So as I went to Howard Law School, I got involved with student government pretty early. Of course, I was a little busy doing some other things like studying law, but that's okay, because I knew I needed to do more. You know, Josh and I talked a lot about doing a stretch assignment. And what I want to encourage us to do today is think about doing a stretch assignment. In other words, what can each one of us do that is outside the realm of what we would normally do? And I decided, with $20 in my pocket, I ended up at Howard Law School, $20, that's what I had. So I said, how can I make a difference in the spirit of Dr. King? And what I decided to do very quickly is this big-headed boy from the Bronx and Queens decided he was going to run for vice president of the first year class. What did I know? Well, that was good for me, not because I really wanted to do it for my own edification. It was good for me because, again, I wanted to make a difference in the spirit and dedication and inspiration of Dr. King. Fast forward, project outreach, working with the poor neighborhoods in D.C. And then it was my last year in law school that I became president of the student body. Imagine being elected president of 600 of the most argumentative law students in the country. And if you know anything about Howard University, you know that's how it is. So there was a buddy of mine who was from Aiken, South Carolina. And if he's watching today, I'm going to give him a shout out. His name was Larry Friday. And Larry was working with Congressman Walter Fontroy. So I started to do an internship. And for those that know the story of Dr. King and know the story of civil rights, you know there's a lot of members of Congress that were very close to the enactment of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And by the way, what would Martin say about the fact that in 1964, 4 years before he was cut down, that he helped create an agency called the EEOC that protects every single person in this room? What would Martin say if he still knew today that that agency still exists, and my partner and I, Evelyn, who's in Arkansas today, proudly do work for this agency? And unfortunately, the work we do for the EEOC is because, as Martin probably predicted, discrimination is alive and well in America. So what would I tell you if all the detractors of this bill in 1964 not only wanted the agency to fail in the first few years, but didn't think the agency would last until 2013? And I will tell you this, the same two categories that were number 1 and 2 when Martin was still alive are still 1 and 2. And that's discrimination based on gender and race. So let's go back to, real quick, and I'm going to finish up, this whole notion of this meeting. So Larry Friday was very politically active in South Carolina, and he was a law student at Howard, and we were really good friends. And Walter Fontroy was one of the leading proponents around the bill to create Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. as a national holiday. So we decided to work behind the scenes and galvanize a march. So it was in 1983, the winter of '83, where this march took place. And we had a few marches. But that's when, front and center, we were on the Capitol, thousands and thousands of students, along with human and civil rights leaders. And that's how we kept chipping and charging, as we say in football, moving the ball down the field, because we had to get bipartisan support to get this bill passed. So I want to leave you with 2 of the famous quotes from Dr. King. And you know, it's funny because everybody talks about a lot of Dr. King's famous speeches. A lot of folks don't talk about the speeches that don't get a lot of the attention. So I'm going to just mention 3 of them. The Birth of a New Nation, I encourage you to listen to that speech. Beyond Vietnam, which he gave not far from here, in a place called Upper Manhattan. And another speech he gave, Where Do We Go From Here? So the two quotations I'm going to leave you with from Dr. King. The first one is the true measure of a man or woman is not where he or she stands in times of comfort and convenience, but where he or she stands in times of controversy and challenge. The second of my most notable Dr. King quotations is one which I think is fitting to today's event. He said, we are all caught up in an inescapable web of mutuality, tied by a single garment of destiny. What affects one directly affects us all indirectly. I want to thank you for your time.
Thank you, Arthur Matthews, for your inspirational talk. You know, today is a really significant day